Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. I'm Clyde Haberman, filling in for Sam Roberts. We were supposed to start the show with honoring the fallen dead on Memorial Day. Instead, we honor dead children, innocent victims in a war that doesn't seem to end. New York Times reporter Edgar Sandoval is at the scene in Uvalde, Texas, and military correspondent David Phillips also joined me. But first, let me get to Edgar Sandoval. Edgar, you've written about small-town America all your career. This area of Texas is now home to you. Can you give us an understanding of this community? What kind of a town Uvalde is like? I know it has about 15,000 people, but what is it exactly?
Yeah, it's like many towns across the Texas border, mostly Latino, generational families. People know each other. They know their grandparents, they know their school teachers. There's one small police department, a couple of grocery stores. So it's really a close-knit family, extended family in a small town.
This is perhaps a premature question, given that the shooting is just a couple of days ago, but is there any way of discerning already what some of the long-range impact of this might be on a town of this size?
I mean, this is going to be just a long, arduous, painful process, not unlike Newtown in Connecticut and actually another small town in Texas, Sutherland Springs,
Right.
which saw its own mass casualty. It's something that people in the other towns tell me that never really recover from. It's just, it's a wound that is always there, unfortunately.
May I assume, from the ethnicity of everybody involved, virtually everybody, including the shooter, are Latino. So is that a factor in any way, or is that just not part of the equation this time? Unlike Buffalo a week ago.
Right. I mean, I think we're still trying to understand the motive. I think one of the things that we may never learn about, but it's really hard to comprehend why someone would be drawn to do something as horrible as this. But we are now anywhere near close to understanding what you would call a motive.
And based upon Governor Abbott's press conference on Wednesday, is it reasonable to assume that nothing in Texas law in regard to guns is going to change?
It doesn't seem like there's a will from the politicians to change. Everyone's hoping that this is going to be the catalyst. But, you know, it seems like everyone is retreating to their corners and sticking to their talking points. But I know some of the family members that I've spoken with really want to see a change. And I know the families in Newtown have been speaking out about also demanding change. And they're just tired of seeing tragedies like this unfold in a regular basis in America.
You're obviously in your car on your way to covering an aspect of the story. How are you and other members of the news media in general treated by families in a situation like this? Are you seen as an intruder, or are you seen to some degree as somebody holding a comforting hand?
You know, it's really on a case-by-case basis. I've come across families who, of course, want their privacy and ask us respectfully not to talk to them. And there's some other family members who just want to talk about their loved ones. I was able to witness some precious moments between two people who have lost loved ones during this horrible tragedy. And I think people are just built differently. Some people welcome you and some people ask you to leave. And I think it's our job to know which one to respect.
Right.
And also to know when to step back as well and let people have their private moment. But some people just want to talk about their loved ones nonstop because that's how they process the grief, even share it to the world. And also want to share, they don't want their loved ones' lives to be in vain, and they want the people to know them who never will get to know them in person.
And I assume that's going to continue with the funerals that are upon us.
Right. It seems like it's too early. I know the Justice of the Peace in town told me yesterday that they started the painful process of releasing the bodies to the family members who have not been able to see their loved ones since this tragedy. So last night and today, they began reunifying with their victims.
Oh, it's so painful. It's so painful. I'm going to let you go. You have a lot of work to do. Thank you, New York Times reporter Edgar Sandoval in Uvalde, Texas. Now let me turn to New York Times military correspondent David Phillips. Dave, thank you for joining us from Colorado. Can I begin with, on a somewhat comparably depressing note, as previous discussion, the suicide rate in the military is quite high. There were 176 suicides in the Army alone in 2021. It's the highest total since going at least back to the September 11th attacks of 2001. What accounts for this?
You know, I think if there was an easy answer and an easy solution, we'd have it. And it's really complex. Remember, the military is made up of society as a whole. So we're seeing a corresponding rise in suicide rates amongst young people in general, and that follows over to the military. There are some real differences with the military, of course, right? There's questions about combat exposure, about traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And certainly those can be risk factors in suicide. But remember, we've basically been out of combat for about 10 years. Like the number of active duty people who have seen combat recently is getting smaller every day. So it's other factors. And I think that if you looked at it, it's a lot of the factors that we see in society as a whole.
They're out of combat, and yet we only got out of Afghanistan some months ago. Is the fact that we have been in virtually a nonstop war situation for 2 full decades, did that just simply impose too much wear and tear on the military?
It's tempting to say one thing or the other, but I don't think it's that simple. I mean, in individual cases, absolutely. I've met those men and women, I've profiled them, and the burden that was given to the professional warfighter in the last 20 years is significant, and it took a toll. At the same time, I don't think that explains most of the numbers. A lot of it is demographics, and demographics that look very familiar to what's going on in the civilian world. For example, men are at a much, much higher rate of dying by suicide, and the military is still overwhelmingly men. Also, people who have access to firearms are at a much higher risk of dying from suicide. And of course, that's something that people in the military have as well. So it's a lot of risk factors. Other things that we might not think about as well. Isolation from your support system, i.e. your family and your community. That's really common when someone goes off and joins the military at 19 or 20. So I want to acknowledge the toll of combat. That's real. I just don't want to let people walk away and say that's the cause of this problem, because it's not that simple.
The numbers of in the military is down a bit. It's 1.4 million, I believe, overall, but that has declined somewhat in the last year or two. Is there a recruitment problem that's coming up? There was a burst of patriotism after September 11th, and a lot of people joined the military who might not have under other circumstances. Are we seeing a waning in interest, and does that mean we're also seeing a decline possibly in the quality of the troops that we're getting now?
So I think that it is a really challenging time to recruit. I mean, not only maybe a waning interest, but also the pandemic. Before that, we had a really hot economy that made civilian jobs really easy to find. All of those things can make it difficult. We'll have to wait. The military releases its numbers each year in the fall, and we'll have to wait to see what this year has been like in terms of, are they having a real hard time? Last year, they met their mission, and they did that in 2 ways. One, yes, they went out to schools and hit the street with recruiters and found young people and put them in boots. But they also retained more people, meaning if you're already serving, they can give you financial incentives or other incentives to say, hey, stick around for 3 more years. We need you, especially in some of these high demand careers that they have. And so by using those 2 different knobs, they've been able to meet their mission. But look, we have a huge military. We have a I think meeting that mission every year is a challenge for these guys. And maybe more so every year that the military becomes less familiar to people, because my generation, very few people served. There wasn't a large scale mobilization. My grandparents' generation in World War II, almost all of them served. They knew the military wasn't strange to them. So how does you as a recruiter come across a cultural divide and say, hey, you might want to think about the Marines or the Coast Guard or the Navy. This could be a good opportunity for you. It's tough.
We should mention that, among other things, you're the author of a book on Eddie Gallagher. It's called Alpha, Eddie Gallagher and the War for the Soul of the Navy SEALs. Is there concern within the military about radicalization within its midst? I mean, Gallagher notoriously killed, a prisoner and then was pardoned by President Trump. But we also had, retired General Michael Flynn, who's essentially called for a military coup. Perhaps I'm being influenced by the fact that just last night I rewatched on TV 7 Days in May about an attempted political coup. But that's probably far-fetched. But is there a growing radicalization when you have a core of military that is, to some degree, detached from normal civilian life?
Yeah. I think that there is a real presence of hard right radicals within the armed services. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think to a certain extent it is reflective of society as a whole. I certainly don't think that as an organization, the military in any way, even quietly, condones or cultivates that type of thinking. But I think you're going to get people who have a very extremist worldview who may come to the military because of that or develop it completely on their own. That will become an issue. Now, do I think that the military is actively looking at it, trying to dissuade it taking hold in any serious way? Yes, I do. Do I think that's a really hard problem? How do you find these guys? How do you, if they're not doing something overtly illegal, how do you punish them for their beliefs? These are really thorny issues that civil society is dealing with too. But I have not gotten the sense, and believe me, as a reporter, if I did get the sense, I would write the story. I have not gotten the sense that this is something endemic to any of the organizations or something that's happening at a high level. I always like to say that the military, active duty military population is about the same size as Phoenix. And just like Phoenix, you're going to get some kooks. You're going to get some amazingly intelligent people. You're going to get some people who are as dumb as a post. You're going to get heroes. You're going to get some people who are the most reprehensible people you'll ever meet. And you just have to try and not make generalizations. But overall, it seems to me that the organizations are healthy.
Right. We have less than a minute. How is the integration of women into positions that were not traditionally female positions, including combat? How is that going? Obviously, there's also the issue of sexual assaults and so on. Is that going reasonably well?
Women in combat seems to be going pretty well. I was just down at Fort Carson not too long ago, and you see 22, 23-year-old female lieutenants who are now leading an infantry platoon, which just a couple of years ago you would not have seen. And to us older folks or people who see the military very traditionally, that's strange. But if you think about it, the military is so young. The average age there's like 23 and a half. And those folks, they've been integrated by gender their entire lives, for the most part. I don't think they think it's strange. If you come into the military and it's that way, you probably don't question it. Now, are there still real problems with sexual assault?
Sure.
Yes. Just like at big universities or any place where you're putting together all sorts of young men, young women, and plus some alcohol or maybe a lot of it, there's serious problems. I actually think the military has in some ways, better tools to deal with it than universities do. And I think that they do take it really seriously.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure there's a certain chants that we had when I was in the Army, in the Vietnam era, are out these days with women in the Army. Thank you.
Yeah, but they have new chants too.
Oh, I bet they do.
Don't worry, things aren't totally cleaned up.
Thank you. Thank you. New York Times military correspondent David Phillips. Next up, Mayor Ed Koch personified New York, but he held a deep secret that some say affected how he governed. Mayor Edward Koch was the brash master of ceremonies of the circus that we call New York. He personified the city with his trademark, "How am I doing?" 9 years after his death, a New York Times article recently examined how the deep secret Ed Koch kept, that he was gay, affected how he governed. With me is the New York Times deputy managing editor, Carolyn, who shepherded that piece into the paper. Can I start with a very basic question? Why do this piece? It's 9 years since Ed Koch has been dead. He chose to keep his sexuality private, to change the pronoun in a famous line from Pope Francis. Who are we to judge?
Right. It's a really good question, and one that I think some of our readers reached out to me to ask about. I think there are a number of reasons. One is it really felt like the unwritten chapter in his biography. By that, I don't mean that people didn't know. A lot of people knew or assumed that Koch was gay.
Yeah.
Some people in the gay press had examined or sometimes, urged him to come out, or were frustrated that he didn't. But I think for a lot of our readers, capturing his life, which was a pretty compartmentalized life,
Yes.
and also capturing this time in New York City, which was not that long ago, where you really couldn't be out and be mayor of New York City. You couldn't be out and be an ambitious politician. It wasn't that long ago. And I was a little worried just as an editor, and myself, I'm getting older, but you see some of the people who were his contemporaries pass away and you think, how are we ever going to capture this? And so it felt like a really important time to try to get people to talk on the record about that life. And I think the portrait that the reporters came up with and delivered was pretty textured and really had a sense of, sure, the politics, but also a little bit of the personal cost and the personal anguish or experience of that. And so I was really struck by how emotionally a lot of readers responded to the piece, which I hadn't really expected.
In terms of his friends and associates, was there resistance on their part to cooperate, or was it quite the opposite, that they were very glad?
They were resistant. I think partly there is, if you work for somebody in politics in such a way that your identity is linked to that person or that politician, I think even after they die, there's a protectiveness of their legacy, a protectiveness of their persona. And they didn't want us to do it. I do think the reporters succeeded in getting some close friends to really talk. But I think you saw from the article, there was still a sense from the loyal people who had worked for him in their younger days of that it's not that they circled the wagons, but they thought of him in a certain way, and that was the way they wanted to keep it.
There are gay groups that have been demanding that Koch's name be stripped from what used to be just simply called the Queensboro Bridge or the 59th Street Bridge.
Or the Feeling Groovy Bridge.
Frankly, the slapping of politicians' names on a lot of our bridges has bothered me too. A very nicely named Brooklyn Battery Tunnel is now named for Hugh Carey, for example, the Bobby Kennedy Bridge and so on, the Mario Cuomo Bridge, bring back the Tappan Zee. But my concern is separate, I guess, from what the gay group's problem is with it. What about Koch still rankles them so many years later?
I think there's a dimension of, I don't know how to describe it, sort of opposition to his legacy, opposition to what he was in office, but also, we didn't capture this really in the story because it wasn't this story, but the arc of his life, he became more conservative. There are still people who feel like, he neglected in a tragic way the AIDS crisis. And so Koch, as we get further and further away, you forget that there was a real anger at him, and I think that came through in the piece as well.
At this stage of our social life, is it really important to know what somebody's sexuality is? I mean, does it loom large? We obviously have openly gay public officials now.
Right.
At least in New York. Maybe in a more conservative area, this might still be an issue. But at this point, where do we journalistically draw lines on how far do we want to plunge into people's personal lives?
It's a really good question, and a really profound question, and it's not one that we take lightly, or we don't go sort of mucking around in people's personal lives. Somebody as significant, a historic figure as the mayor of New York City, and somebody who still is, I think, the embodiment of a modern big city mayor in a lot of ways, big persona, big personality, really connected to the city. This definitely felt to me like an important dimension. And obviously he had shared it with some friends, if not with the public. So it felt like a really important chapter for us to capture. I think generally that's not something that we seek to do in people's personal lives, and it's something that we don't take lightly.
And reader reaction to this very long article. I think it was about 8,500 words. My lips were hurting by the end. It was a very well written article.
I have to tell you, I've been at the Times since 2007, and I have rarely experienced the kind of outpouring of emotion over this piece. Now, the number of older gays and lesbians who wrote to me and said, you captured the kind of pain and anguish of the closet in a way that, a lot of young people don't know, and that I experienced. And there were also people who didn't know this about Ed Koch and were glad to know it, if a little sad to see that it was an unrealized part of his life.
The piece touched very briefly on this during the 1977 mayoral campaign, which was a very rich campaign at a very difficult time in New York's history. We were just, fiscally underwater. The main runoff was between him and Mario Cuomo, and these signs began to appear in Queens: "Vote for Cuomo, not the homo." That a lot of people felt the Cuomo campaign was in some form behind, perhaps even Andrew Cuomo, very young then. Did Koch ever really, he sort of said, I forgive the Cuomos on this. Did he really?
No. I think to the very end, he both held them responsible personally and did not let that go. That was a real source of, that was a grudge. And he really, even if you recall, I think we had an interview that we ran when he died. Yes. You remember we used to do the last word, and he talked about that.
Oh yeah, no, it weighed on him very heavily. I covered most of the first term of Koch before I became a foreign correspondent, and I did a story one time. It was an era of budget cuts, very tight budgets, and a lot of the budget cuts fell heavily on what might be considered family-friendly spending, schools and various family programs. There was an undercurrent within among a lot of New Yorkers that there was not a family-friendly environment at the upper reaches of City Hall, which was all single men. Koch, Nat Leventhal at the time, his first deputy, Bobby Wagner Jr., Bob Tierney, his counsel, some others. They got very nervous about this, and a day later they issued a press release listing all the married people in the administration with the number of children that they had. Sorry for this long-winded, statement in form of a question, but did that kind of sensitivity linger, do you think?
Their antennae were always up. For anything that sort of suggested that he was gay or was overly close to the gay community, or the Greenwich Village Bachelor.
Right.
And I think
which itself is sort of like a code word, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, like the story you describe, there was acute sensitivity, and they really, worked to rebut or to address this all the time. They didn't want to talk about it, basically.
Yeah.
And they didn't want you to talk about it.
Well, that was for sure. But it was a sensitivity that it was even extended to just sort of policy issues. I certainly had no homophobic intent behind it. It had to do with spending.
Right.
But they could not see it in that kind of context.
Right, and I think they sort of worried that anything in the public mind that emphasized that status of his, unmarried male, would somehow kind of plant the seed or encourage that view that he was gay.
You mentioned earlier the reaction that a lot of readers have had, including older gays, but is there also an undercurrent of what the hell is wrong with you, New York Times, doing this kind
Always,
of story?
yes.
I mean, there always is, right?
There was an overcurrent of it too, yeah. I think the reaction I would put in a couple of buckets. One, I already knew this, why are you writing about it? Why are you writing about it so long? And two, there was a little bit of discomfort. This is a guy who didn't want this to be known, was sensitive about it. Why write this story? So the reporters actually engaged with a lot of readers and explained the reason for doing the story, but there was, I would say, pretty passionate reaction in all those camps. But there was a lot of gratitude.
Yes, I bet there was on all counts. Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn Ryan, Deputy Managing Editor of the New York Times. For CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman. Thank you for watching, and have a good Memorial Day weekend.